Good afternoon from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. You're looking at a live view of Space Launch Complex 41, where an Atlas V rocket is now about 2.5 hours from liftoff with 2 commercial communications satellites for SES, one of the world's largest geostationary satellite operators. 2 communication satellites are buttoned up for launch inside that nose cone of the Atlas V out on pad 41. Right now, ULA is going through the final poll before they begin loading cryogenic propellants on board the Atlas V out on pad 41 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. The countdown clock on the upper right, you can see, is at a built-in hold. This is a planned stop or pause point in the countdown at T-minus 2 hours and holding. Roughly 3 minutes or so remaining in this built-in hold, 2.5 minutes actually remaining in this built-in hold. And we should hear word from ULA shortly on whether the launch team is go to proceed with the loading of cryogenic propellants into the Atlas V this afternoon. United Launch Alliance has a 45-minute launch window today to get this mission off the ground. That launch window opens at 5:36 p.m. Eastern Time or 21:36 UTC. I'm Stephen Clark from SpaceflightNow.com. I'm reporting live from Kennedy Space Center a few miles away from Pad 41 this afternoon. I'll be talking you through the remainder of this afternoon's countdown as well as the launch sequence this evening. Again, there's a 45-minute launch window today opening at 5:36 p.m. Eastern Time or 21:36 UTC. That window closes at 6:21 p.m. Eastern. Right now, there are no significant weather concerns here on Florida's Space Coast. It is a mostly sunny afternoon, a nice warm autumn day here in Florida. Just a few scattered clouds overhead. It is breezy. You may notice our camera is shaking in the gusty winds here at Kennedy Space Center. Right now, these winds are within limits, so no issue expected from these winds at this point. We'll see how these winds evolve throughout the coming 2.5 hours. The official weather forecast calls for a 90% probability of favorable conditions for liftoff this afternoon. On the left side of your screen, you can see the propellant load status. The one tank, the Atlas kerosene tank, which is labeled RP1 here. It's rocket propellant 1. It's a highly refined rocket-grade kerosene. That tank is already loaded full of fuel. That was loaded with about 25,000 gallons of kerosene fuel yesterday after the rollout of the Atlas V to Pad 41 from its hangar over at the Vertical Integration Facility. The remaining propellant load operations this afternoon involve loading super-cold cryogenics into the other 3 propellant tanks on the Atlas V. So liquid oxygen will be loaded into the first stage, and then liquid hydrogen fuel as well as liquid oxygen will be loaded into the Centaur upper stage this afternoon. Right now, we're not aware of any technical issues that would stand in the way of launch today. We have just heard confirmation from United Launch Alliance that the team is go for cryogenic tanking, so that's a big milestone in this afternoon's countdown. The countdown began at about 7 hours and 20 minutes before launch. It actually, the clock began ticking at 10:16 a.m. Eastern Time, or 14:16 UTC. And ULA's launch team stationed a few miles to the south of the pad in the building known as the Atlas Spaceflight Operations Center. Ran through the initial pre-flight checks. They powered up the Atlas V rocket, checked its guidance system, ran through some flight control system checkouts, checked the GPS system on board that will be used to track the location of the rocket in flight. And all that led us to the point now where the team has given the go for cryogenic loading of liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen into the Atlas V on Pad 41. You can see on the upper right that countdown clock began ticking about an hour or about a minute ago at T-minus 2 hours. We just passed T-minus 1 hour 59 minutes and counting. So we'll be bringing you live views throughout the remainder of the countdown of the Atlas V on Pad 41 as ULA begins to run through these cryogenic loading operations here at Cape Canaveral, Florida. Again, this mission is set to launch 2 commercial television broadcast satellites for SES. That's a Luxembourg-based company that operates a global fleet of communications satellites, providing internet connectivity, data services, and Most relevantly for these satellites, television broadcast services. These two satellites are heading into orbit to provide C-band TV broadcast services, programming that will ultimately reach millions of American homes from a position in geostationary orbit about 22,000 miles over the equator. That's the destination for this evening's mission by ULA's Atlas V rocket. T-minus 1 hour, 42 minutes, 41 seconds, and counting. The countdown clock resumed from the built-in hold at T-minus 2 hours about 18 minutes ago and is now making its way down to the next built-in hold this afternoon, which is going to be at T-minus 4 minutes. That hold will last for a half hour. So there's about a 30-minute difference in the clock you're seeing on the upper right, which is the official ULA countdown clock that the team is working off of in the Launch Control Center right now. And the actual L- time, launch minus time, which is currently launch minus 2 hours and 12 minutes. There's, again, a 30-minute built-in hold planned in the countdown at T-minus 4 minutes and holding. At my last update, I mentioned that ULA's launch team had given the go for cryogenic propellant loading, and that operation has begun. So around 66,000 gallons of cryogenic liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen will be flowed into the Atlas V rocket this afternoon. This process begins with chill down, thermal conditioning of the various transfer lines leading into each of the cryogenic tanks on the vehicle. And we've just received confirmation from ULA that liquid oxygen loading onto the Centaur upper stage is underway. So this is the first of the 3 cryogenic propellant tanks on the Atlas V launch vehicle that'll be filled this afternoon. And the Centaur upper stage liquid oxygen tank will be loaded with about 4,150 gallons of oxidizer. We just heard also from ULA that that liquid oxygen tank is now 10% full. In the coming minutes, preparations will get underway to load cryogenic liquid oxygen into the Atlas first stage, as well as liquid hydrogen into the Centaur upper stage. But right now, the first step in the tanking process, cryogenic tanking process, is loading of liquid oxygen into the Centaur upper stage. I also mentioned earlier that the kerosene fuel on the Atlas first stage is already on board the vehicle. That was actually loaded into the rocket yesterday afternoon, after the Atlas V rolled to the pad from the vertical integration facility. ULA has just confirmed that loading of liquid oxygen into the Atlas first stage is now getting underway. This is the largest propellant tank on the Atlas V rocket, and it will be containing about 48,800 gallons of liquid oxygen when fully loaded. The first stage of the Atlas V is powered by an RD-180 engine produced by MPO Energomash. That's a Russian engine manufacturer, and it consumes liquid oxygen as an oxidizer and kerosene as a fuel. And this dual nozzle RD-180 engine produces about 860,000 pounds of thrust at full throttle. So this liquid oxygen is now loading into the Atlas first stage to help power that stage's RD-180 engine. I mentioned earlier that liquid oxygen is already flowing also into the Centaur upper stage. The Centaur is powered by a single RL-10 engine produced by Aerojet Rocketdyne, and that engine will fire 3 times on tonight's mission to place the SES-20 and SES-21 communications satellites into a nearly circular geosynchronous orbit about 22,000 miles above Earth. The flight profile tonight will take more than 6 hours from the time of launch until the deployment of the second of the 2 SES satellite payloads. That enables the Atlas V's Centaur upper stage to coast up to geosynchronous altitude over several hours before its final maneuver to place these 2 satellites into their targeted deployment orbit. Now T-minus 1 hour, 33 minutes, 20 seconds. We've added the second clock below the red clock, showing the time to launch. Again, there's a 30-minute difference between the countdown clock that the ULA team is working off of, which we have here on the top in this graphic. Below that, we've added an L- clock, launch minus 2 hours and 3 minutes now until the scheduled liftoff time of 5:36 p.m. Eastern or 21:36 UTC. Everything looking good so far in the early stages of cryogenic tanking on the Atlas V. T-minus 1 hour, 26 minutes, 12 seconds, hour 56 minutes remaining until launch time. The Centaur liquid oxygen tank is now 3/4 full, just past the 75% mark according to ULA. And the Atlas first stage liquid oxygen tank has just transitioned from slow fill to fast fill mode. And this allows the tank to be filled up at a faster rate. Again, that liquid oxygen tank on the Atlas first stage is the largest of the 4 tanks on the vehicle. Now 1 hour and 52 minutes remaining. The Centaur liquid oxygen tank on the upper stage of the Atlas V is nearing the 100% full mark. It passed the 90% mark a few moments ago. And chill down conditioning of the transfer lines for liquid hydrogen loading on the Centaur upper stage is also underway. So we should hear a call out in the next few minutes that liquid hydrogen loading has begun on the Centaur upper stage. Everything progressing right on track for an on-time launch this afternoon at 5:36 p.m. Eastern Time, 21:36 UTC, from Pad 41 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. This will be the 96th flight of an Atlas V rocket, dating back to the maiden Atlas V launch on August the 21st of 2002, and it will be the 6th launch of an Atlas V so far this year. And we just heard a call from ULA that the Centaur liquid oxygen tank is now in topping mode, having just passed the 96% full mark, and Atlas liquid oxygen is now at 20% full. If you're just joining us and you haven't had a chance to do so, please hit the like button on our YouTube stream. That helps us gain a bigger audience for our coverage. Again, we're covering the countdown of ULA's Atlas V rocket at Cape Canaveral, Florida. The clock is ticking toward a liftoff time of 5:36 p.m. Eastern Time, 21:36 UTC. So please hit the like button if you haven't done so. That really helps us a lot. Now inside of 1 hour and 50 minutes until liftoff time. Atlas first stage liquid oxygen just passed the 40% mark. So about 40% of that tank has been filled with liquid oxygen, which is chilled down to about minus 298 degrees Fahrenheit. The liquid oxygen tank on the Centaur upper stage is currently in a stop flow status. The team saw some kind of oscillations during that topping of the liquid oxygen tank and stopped the flow of liquid oxygen into the Centaur stage. However, it does sound like the team will set up to resume topping of liquid oxygen on the Centaur upper stage shortly after performing an additional chill down of the liquid oxygen transfer lines. The chill down process, as I mentioned before, thermally conditions transfer lines as well as various components of the vehicle for the shock of the super cold propellants. Again, the liquid oxygen is at minus 298 degrees Fahrenheit or so. The liquid hydrogen is chilled down to about minus 423 degrees Fahrenheit. So these are very cold fluids that are being pumped into the Atlas V this afternoon. Again, this is a stoppage of flow into the liquid oxygen tank on the Centaur upper stage, but the team discussing their plan to go forward to chill down the transfer line once more and then resume the flow of liquid oxygen. So it doesn't seem like this is a major issue at this point, but we'll update you when we have further news on that issue. Now an hour and 42 minutes until the opening of tonight's launch window. That's at 5:36 p.m. Eastern Time or 21:36 UTC. Again, the clock you're seeing on the upper right, you're seeing two different times. The time in red that says minus 1 hour 11 minutes is the official countdown clock that the ULA launch team is working off of over in the Atlas Space Flight Operations Center, where the control center is located for this afternoon's countdown. That clock is heading to a built-in hold of T-minus 4 minutes. That hold will last for 30 minutes once that clock hits the T-minus 4 minute mark. And that 30-minute difference we've noted here in the time to launch. So the time to launch is 1 hour, 41 minutes, and 13 seconds at this point. You're looking again at a live view of Space Launch Complex 41, where ULA's Atlas V rocket stands about 196 feet, or roughly 60 meters in height. And inside the very top of that rocket, inside the nose cone, are two commercial television broadcasting satellites for SES, one of the world's largest operators of geostationary communications satellites. If you look closely out at pad 41, you can see some of the vapor starting to stream away from the vehicle as cryogenic tanking progresses this afternoon. That's from the boil-off of liquid oxygen into a gaseous state, and then that is vented away from the pad. You can see that vent starting to appear. It'll become more prominent later in the afternoon as the tanks fill up. Right now, the liquid oxygen tank on the first stage is half full. Again, the RP-1 fuel tank on the first stage was loaded yesterday. We just heard from ULA's launch team that they have resumed topping of liquid oxygen on the Centaur upper stage. So it does appear for now that issue is behind the team, and the team has cleared that issue, hopefully. And again, the liquid oxygen tank on the Centaur upper stage is back in topping mode after a stop flow for a few minutes here. Liquid oxygen on the first stage has passed the 50% full mark, and we're waiting on the start of liquid hydrogen fueling, cryogenic hydrogen fuel, to be loaded into the Centaur upper stage in the next few minutes. Here's a look at the propellant tanks on board the Atlas V. I've mentioned before the Atlas RP1 tank. That's the highly refined kerosene that fuels the first stage RD-180 engine. Has already been loaded with its 25,000 gallons of propellant fuel. That was completed yesterday afternoon, a few hours after the rocket arrived on the pad after rollout from the vertical integration facility just south of the Pad 41 area. So that kerosene is stored near room temperature, so it can be loaded onto the vehicle and can remain on the Atlas V almost indefinitely through numerous launch attempts. But the cryogenics cannot. The cryogenics boil off in the warm Florida atmosphere and have to be loaded and drained with each countdown.
ECS, go ahead.
Yeah, can I get your status on step 450?
The liquid oxygen tank on the Atlas first stage contains 48,800 gallons, and we've just heard that that tank has passed the 60% full mark, so it's over halfway loaded. And liquid oxygen on the Centaur upper stage is almost full. That tank contains 4,150 gallons of oxidizer. We're still waiting on the start of liquid hydrogen loading. When that gets underway, more than 12,000 gallons of liquid hydrogen will be loaded into that Centaur upper stage. We did just hear confirmation a moment ago that liquid oxygen is at flight level on the Centaur upper stage, so that loading process is complete. Liquid oxygen again on the Atlas first stage, 60%, and we're waiting on the start of liquid hydrogen loading on the Centaur upper stage. Now T-minus 1 hour, 2 minutes, 35 seconds, about an hour and 32 minutes actually until launch time this evening. I'll draw your attention once more to the upper left. We have a graphic showing the propellant load status on the Atlas V rocket. As you can see, the liquid oxygen tank on the Centaur upper stage. That's the stage that will do some of the fine maneuvering to place these two SES communication satellites into orbit. That liquid oxygen tank has been fully loaded with more than 4,100 gallons of oxidizer. We're still awaiting the start of liquid hydrogen fueling on board that stage. Down below, the Atlas booster stage is fully fueled with kerosene. That was completed yesterday, and the liquid oxygen tank has just passed the 70% mark. So we're updating this graphic as we get updates from ULA on the progress of this afternoon's tanking operation. This is all leading up to liftoff on the 96th flight of an Atlas V rocket, the 6th Atlas V flight of the year. The 45-minute launch window opens at 5:36 p.m. Eastern Time, 21:36 UTC. And right now the weather appears quite favorable for an on-time launch this afternoon, with just a few clouds in the sky over Florida Space Coast. It is a breezy afternoon here, but right now those winds are within limits. ULA just gave us an update a couple of minutes ago that all weather parameters are currently green. So there's no violation of any weather parameter at the current time, and 90% chance of those weather parameters remaining green through the rest of the countdown. T-minus 1 hour and counting. Again, the countdown clock is heading to a built-in hold at T-minus 4 minutes, so we're actually 90 minutes from launch time, but the countdown clock that the launch control team is working off of is the clock we're showing in red on the upper right, just past the T-minus 60-minute point. And below that, we have the time to launch clock at L-minus, launch minus 1 hour, 29 minutes, 35 seconds. Liquid hydrogen tanking on the Centaur upper stage is now getting underway after a chill down procedure to thermally condition the hydrogen lines leading into the Centaur upper stage. So this is the final cryogenic propellant tank to be loaded this afternoon. About 12,000 gallons will go on board. Now an hour and 23 minutes until the opening of this afternoon's launch window here at Cape Canaveral, Florida. Liquid oxygen on the Atlas first stage has passed the 90% mark. And liquid hydrogen on the Centaur upper stage is now 10% full. We also heard a call from ULA's launch team a few moments ago that flight control final preps are underway or are getting underway at this point. This will include an engine steering check on the RD-180 engine at the bottom of the first stage to check out that engine's thrust vector control system that will be used for in-flight steering. These checks, also called slew checks, are set to conclude about an hour before launch, so these will be conducted over the next 20 to 30 minutes or so. Again, no reports of any issues right now in the countdown that would prevent an on-time launch. The Atlas first stage has just reached roughly 97% full and is now in topping mode. So in just a few more minutes, the Atlas first stage will be fully loaded with both of its propellant tanks, kerosene and liquid oxygen full. And liquid hydrogen on the Centaur upper stage has just passed the 30% full mark. So we're definitely over the halfway point, well beyond the halfway point of cryogenic tanking this afternoon. Hour and 19 minutes remaining until the scheduled launch time. The countdown clock that the launch control team is working off of is just past the T-minus 49 minute point. And that clock will be stopped at T-minus 4 minutes for a pre-planned built-in hold that will last for 30 minutes. Again, at this time in the countdown, an engine steering check on the Atlas V's RD-180 engine should be getting underway. This is a checkout and verification that the thrust vector control system is working as designed. This is the system that essentially pivots the thrust from the RD-180 main engine during the flight to steer the Atlas V on the proper corridor toward orbit. Tonight's mission will be heading due east from Cape Canaveral, targeting an equatorial geosynchronous orbit. So it'll be arcing to the east over the Atlantic Ocean, bound for that orbit. Liftoff remains scheduled for 5:36 p.m. Eastern Time, 21:36 UTC, an hour and 17 minutes from now. The payloads on board are the SES-20 and SES-21 television broadcasting satellites. These satellites are heading to orbit to begin 15-year missions, beaming television programming and radio signals across the United States. The Centaur liquid hydrogen tank just passed the 50% full mark, so that 12,000-gallon tank now half full. Again, weather conditions here locally on Florida Space Coast continue to look favorable for launch this evening. It is breezy. You can see some of that vegetation between our camera site and the launch pad blowing in the wind here, but those winds are within limits at last report from United Launch Alliance. Every parameter is currently observed green for launch, at least weather-wise. We also haven't heard any issues from a technical standpoint that would prevent launch this afternoon. The only issue of note that we've heard was a brief stoppage in loading of liquid oxygen on the Centaur upper stage, but that only lasted a few minutes, and that tank is now fully loaded. And the countdown has some time, some buffer built into the clock. That's why there are built-in holds here in the Atlas V countdown to make up time if they do fall behind. So we don't expect that issue alone to impact the target launch time this afternoon, which is now less than an hour and 15 minutes from now. The Centaur liquid hydrogen tank just passed the 80% point. Again, 12,300 gallons of hydrogen fuel chilled down to minus 423 degrees Fahrenheit are being pumped or loaded into the Centaur upper stage. At this time, now 80% of that volume has been filled on the Centaur liquid hydrogen tank. If you're just joining us, you're watching a live view of Space Launch Complex 41 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida, where an Atlas V rocket built and owned by United Launch Alliance is awaiting liftoff at 5:36 p.m. Eastern Time, 1 hour, 11 minutes, 42 seconds from now, with 2 commercial communications satellites on board. I'm Stephen Clark from spaceflightnow.com, reporting live from Kennedy Space Center on this afternoon's countdown. If you're just joining us, again, if you haven't had a chance to do so, please hit the like button on our YouTube stream. That helps us gain a bigger audience for our coverage. Again, please hit the like button on our YouTube stream. That helps us a lot. And the latest update from the Atlas Launch Control Team is that the first stage liquid oxygen tank has just reached the 100% full point. So 3 of the 4 tanks on the Atlas V rocket have been fully loaded. All that remains is about 20% of the liquid hydrogen tank on the Centaur upper stage. And we just heard that is just past the 90% full mark now on the Centaur liquid hydrogen system. The Centaur liquid hydrogen tank is just passing the 96% full mark and is currently in topping mode, so we're just a few minutes away from having a fully loaded Atlas V rocket on pad 41. The cryogenic tanking operation is nearing completion this afternoon. We're now less than an hour from launch. You're seeing, if you're just watching this view of pad 41, you may have just seen a helicopter pass above and behind the pad. That's a NASA security helicopter. That's a part of a standard pre-launch security sweep that's performed before all launches here on Florida Space Coast. So now 58 minutes, 50 seconds until the opening of the launch window this afternoon. United Launch Alliance's team has just confirmed that the Centaur liquid hydrogen tank on the Atlas V rocket is now full at flight level. So the vehicle is now fully loaded with all of its propellants for today's mission. We've been monitoring the cryogenic tanking operation this afternoon, in which liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen were loaded into the vehicle. Kerosene fuel was loaded into the rocket yesterday onto the Atlas first stage. And then the 3 strap-on solid rocket boosters provided by Northrop Grumman came with their solid powder propellant already preloaded into those casings when they arrived from the factory, from the Northrop Grumman factory out in Utah. So those already have their propellants on board. And then today we've seen the cryogenic liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen loaded on board. So right now the Atlas V is fully loaded. It weighs just shy of 1.1 million pounds fully loaded with propellants. And at liftoff, the RD-180 engine and the 3 strap-on solid rocket motors will generate just shy of 2 million pounds of thrust, about 1.9 million pounds and change of thrust at liftoff. So launch is now 50 minutes and 35 seconds away. The countdown clock you're seeing on the upper right is at T-minus 20 minutes and 30 seconds, heading toward a built-in hold at T-minus 4 minutes. That hold will last for a half hour. This view comes from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. It's been set up by our photographer Michael Kane out at the press viewing site at the Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, a couple of miles south of the Atlas V launch pad. So it gives us a different vantage point of that fully fueled Atlas V on pad 41. Off to the right here is the vertical integration facility. That's the building with the U.S. flag and the ULA corporate logo. That's the vertical hangar. Stands nearly 300 feet tall, where the Atlas V was stacked over the previous few weeks. And then it was rolled from that hangar out to the pad yesterday on its mobile launch platform. So just to recap where we are in the countdown, less than 50 minutes remaining until the opening of tonight's launch window. The Atlas V has been fully fueled and fully loaded with propellants. Everything looking good for an on-time launch this evening with the SES-20 and SES-21 commercial communications satellites. Now less than 48 minutes, 15 seconds until the opening of the launch window. The countdown clock coming up on T-minus 18 minutes. This is one of several U.S. launches planned from spaceports this week. One of the other missions is set to launch tomorrow. That's the Crew 5 mission, where a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket and Dragon spacecraft will carry a crew of 4, 2 U.S. astronauts, rather, 1 Japanese astronaut and 1 Russian cosmonaut to the International Space Station. That launch is scheduled just a couple of miles north of pad 41. Here's a live shot of the Falcon 9 rocket on pad 39A with SpaceX's Dragon Endurance spacecraft on top. This launch is scheduled to occur at 12 p.m. noon Eastern Time, or 1600 UTC tomorrow, again carrying a crew of 4 to begin a 5-month expedition on the International Space Station. One of the other missions we've been covering this week is the launch of the next batch of Starlink Internet satellites from out in Vandenberg Space Force Base, California. That's also launching on a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket. And we just learned a few minutes ago from SpaceX that that launch, which was originally scheduled for yesterday, that was delayed until today for some additional pre-launch checkouts, that launch has now been rescheduled for tomorrow evening at 4:10 p.m. Pacific, 7:10 p.m. Eastern, again from Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. And that launch is scheduled for tomorrow evening, and that assumes, the launch tomorrow evening assumes that the Crew 5 mission does take off tomorrow. If the Crew 5 launch delays, we expect the Starlink launch from California to delay as well. Also later this week, there's a Falcon 9 launch scheduled from Pad 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station as well. That's scheduled for Thursday night, a little after 7 p.m. local time here in Florida, 2300 UTC, with two Intelsat commercial communication satellites. These satellites for Intelsat are actually very similar to the satellites that ULA is launching tonight from a few miles to the north at Pad 41, part of the deployment of new C-band television broadcast satellites by the large geostationary satellite operators. These satellites are being deployed as part of what's known as the C-band clearing by the Federal Communications Commission. And that involves actually repurposing some of the C-band spectrum for use in terrestrial 5G cell phone connectivity.
Yeah, we're going to hold off on performing start through fill sequence pending closure of this Cox issue. Roger.
So a portion of the C-band spectrum has been repurposed to 5G cell phone mobile connectivity, and that requires big satellite operators like SES and Intelsat to launch new satellites that are designed to operate in a different segment of the C-band spectrum to continue providing television and radio broadcast services over the United States. And tonight's launch is part of that. The launch on Thursday with SpaceX launching 2 Intelsat satellites is also part of that process, which is due to wrap up in the 2023 timeframe. Now, T-minus 14 minutes and 40 seconds, less than 45 minutes remaining until the opening of tonight's launch window. Countdown clock you're seeing on the upper right is approaching T-minus 14 minutes. At T-minus 4 minutes, about 10 minutes from now, that clock will hold at T-minus 4 minutes for a planned pause in the countdown clock that will last 30 minutes. And that will allow that time to launch clock and the countdown clock to sync up to the same time. And then the countdown clock will resume at T-minus 4 minutes and go all the way down until liftoff of the Atlas V from Pad 41 at Cape Canaveral, Florida. The 2 satellites on board tonight's mission are named SES-20 and SES-21. These 2 satellites are heading to geosynchronous orbit. The Atlas V rocket will actually deploy these satellites into a near circular orbit, nearly 22,000 miles above the Earth, very close to the equator. And this requires 3 burns, a very complex mission by the Centaur upper stage on the Atlas V to maneuver into this high-energy, high-altitude orbit before deploying these 2 satellites. These 2 spacecraft, again, SES-20 and SES-21, were built by Boeing. They're based on Boeing's 702 SP satellite platform. This stack of satellites weighs about 3.3 metric tons fully fueled, and they use all-electric propulsion, meaning there's no conventional hydrazine fuel on board. The only propulsion means of these satellites is through ion thrusters. This is a view provided by Boeing and SES of the encapsulation of these 2 satellites inside the Atlas V rocket's payload fairing over at the Astrotech payload processing facility a few miles from the Space Center here. You can see those 2 halves of this large payload shroud moving into position in this time-lapse video with these 2 satellites stacked one on top of the other. SES-20 is actually on top of this stack. SES-21 is located below. They're virtually identical. Again, about 3.3 metric tons total mass for this stack of 2 SES communication satellites. After encapsulation inside the payload fairing, this entire payload module was transported out to the vertical integration facility, where ULA had the Atlas V rocket stacked, waiting on the payloads, and then that payload that payload module was hoisted and raised on top of the rocket and put in place to finish the buildup of the Atlas V inside the vertical integration facility. And that vertical hangar you see off to the right of the rocket with the ULA logo is where the rocket was stacked over the course of the past few weeks. That culminated with rollout of the Atlas V to the pad yesterday, and countdown preps were completed yesterday and overnight, and the countdown clock officially began today at 10:16 a.m. Eastern Time. That 7-hour plus countdown is now in the final stages. About 41 minutes left until the opening of tonight's launch window here at Cape Canaveral, Florida. Now T-minus 8 minutes, 30 seconds and counting, 4.5 minutes remaining until the built-in hold at T-minus 4 minutes. If you're just joining us, you're looking at a live view of Space Launch Complex 41 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida, where an Atlas V rocket from United Launch Alliance is scheduled to launch this evening at 5:36 p.m. Eastern Time. You can see it's a breezy day here on Florida Space Coast, but all weather parameters are currently green for launch at last report from United Launch Alliance. If you haven't had a chance to do so, please hit the like button on our YouTube stream. That helps us gain a larger following for our coverage and ensures that we bring this exciting launch to as many people as possible. So please hit the like button there on our YouTube stream if you haven't already. Also, if you haven't done so, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. You'll get alerts when we're going live, so you'll never miss a launch and never miss any of our live streams of any of the spaceflight activity here in Florida. And we'll ask you to consider please becoming a member of our YouTube channel. If you haven't done that, you can gain access to bonus video features that we have for members only, depending on which membership level you choose from. And this helps us continue and expand our coverage. We enjoy bringing this live coverage to you. And if we want to improve our coverage level, we need a little bit of your support, so we'd appreciate you considering that. You can also contribute there on our YouTube chat through the Super Chat function as well. Countdown clock just passed T-minus 7 minutes. 37 minutes until launch time. You're seeing some periodic views of the NASA security helicopter making security sweeps across the Space Center. It's a busy week here in Florida. 2 different rockets are currently on the launch pad. Different launch pads here. You're looking at the Atlas V on pad 41, awaiting a liftoff in 36 minutes with 2 commercial communications satellites owned by SES. And then tomorrow, a Falcon 9 rocket from SpaceX is set to launch a few miles to the north at pad 39A at Kennedy Space Center with a crew of 4 heading to the space station. Both of these rockets currently on the launch pad, different launch pads here in Florida. And then later in the week, another Falcon 9 is scheduled to launch from pad 40 a few miles to the south with another pair of commercial communications satellites. So 3 launches on 3 consecutive days currently on the books here at the Cape Canaveral Space Force Station and Kennedy Space Center. The countdown clock just stopped at T-minus 4 minutes and holding. This is a pre-planned built-in hold that is expected to last for 30 minutes. So you're seeing that clock in red having stopped now at T-minus 4 minutes. The time to launch clock continues ticking. Liftoff remains set for 5:36 p.m. Eastern Time or 21:36 UTC. ULA has a 45-minute launch window tonight. During this hold, the teams will catch up on any work that may have been running behind schedule from earlier in the countdown. And then at 7 minutes before launch, with 3 minutes remaining in the hold, ULA launch conductor Ron McKee will poll his team in the Atlas Space Flight Operations Center for their go or no-go to enter into the terminal countdown. If all teams are go, all stations are go, the clock will resume at T-minus 4 minutes. Now 30 minutes left until today's launch. ULA's Atlas V rocket is now fully fueled out on pad 41. That cryogenic loading operation concluded a short time ago, and the rocket weighs nearly 1.1 million pounds, fully loaded with kerosene, liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen, and solid propellants. The two payloads on board have a combined mass of about 3.3 metric tons, so just a very small fraction of this entire stack is a payload mass. These two satellites are nearly identical, built by Boeing, and are heading to geosynchronous orbit tonight. In the final pre-launch weather briefing to the launch team, the launch weather officer from the U.S. Space Force's 45th Weather Squadron has given her outlook for launch time this evening, and the weather across the board appears to be favorable. All the weather rules are currently observed go for launch, and are forecast to remain go for the remainder of the countdown. No significant weather concerns to speak of this afternoon. These breezy winds are not an issue for this launch. And there's some clouds hanging over the spaceport right now. The cloud cover has increased over the last couple of hours, with some scattered clouds over the launch pad, but those are not expected to be an issue for the launch either.
Go prop one. Fuel fill sequence is complete. Right.
We just heard a report from ULA's launch control team that the fuel fill sequence on the Russian-made RD-180 engine is complete. This is one of the preparatory steps to condition that engine for ignition. The countdown clock remains in this built-in hold at T-minus 4 minutes, and we're now 26 minutes from the opening of tonight's launch window for the SES-20 and SES-21 mission. This Atlas V rocket is heading toward geosynchronous orbit, just shy of geosynchronous orbit, at an altitude of about 21,700 miles, where the rocket's Centaur upper stage will deploy the SES-20 and SES-21 commercial TV broadcasting satellites very close to their final orbital positions, and this will expedite the entry into service for those satellites instead of requiring months for orbit raising and maneuvers to reach their operating altitude. SES expects these satellites to be able to enter service in just a few weeks after launch. Now 25 minutes from the opening of the launch window. And an update from the Launch Control Center, the trajectory file for tonight's mission is now being uploaded into the Atlas V's flight computer, known by the acronym INCA, I-N-C-A. That trajectory file takes into account the real-time observations of upper-level winds throughout the atmosphere at different altitudes. And based on those wind measurements at different altitudes, thanks to weather balloons, the launch team can select a trajectory file that is a best fit for those wind profiles, and that trajectory file is now being uploaded into the Atlas V's guidance computer. The opening of the window now 24 minutes away. We're going to show now a video package from United Launch Alliance giving an overview of what to expect on tonight's mission. Again, this mission is carrying 2 commercial communication satellites into orbit for SES. This is a replay of a previous Atlas V launch in this same Atlas V configuration with 3 strap-on solid rocket boosters. The rocket will fire off the pad with nearly 2 million pounds of thrust, and that thrust will be vectored from the main engine to head to guide the rocket due east from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. It'll pass the speed of sound in about 40 seconds. A few seconds later, at T plus 57 seconds, it'll pass maximum aerodynamic pressure. And then about 1:57 seconds, the Atlas V will jettison the 3 strap-on solid rocket boosters. Those will fall down into the Atlantic Ocean. At nearly 3.5 minutes, the payload shroud on top of the Atlas V will be jettisoned once the rocket reaches space. And then at T plus 4 minutes, 19 seconds, the Atlas V's RD-180 engine will shut down. That will be followed a few moments later by staging. The first stage will separate from the Centaur upper stage, which will begin its pre-start sequence. And then it will light its Aerojet Rocketdyne RL-10 engine, producing more than 20,000 pounds of thrust. This RL-10 engine is built by Aerojet Rocketdyne, burns a mixture of cryogenic liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen propellants. The first burn of this RL-10 will conclude nearly 12 minutes into the mission to place the payloads into a preliminary low Earth orbit. About 10 minutes later, at T plus 23 minutes, there will be a restart of that upper stage engine, followed by shutdown. And then there will be a long coast period of more than 5 hours to get the rocket and the 2 satellites up to geosynchronous altitude at 22,000 miles. And at that point, the Centaur will relight the RL-10 engine for a 2-minute burn. This will circularize the orbit from an oval-shaped transfer orbit into a more circular geosynchronous orbit. You can see this animation from ULA shows the 2 SES satellites stacked one on top of the other. SES-20 will separate first about 5 hours, 38 minutes into the flight. And at 6 hours, 18 minutes, we'll see separation of SES-21. These satellites are virtually identical. SES-21 actually is slightly heavier, has a beefed up structure to support the weight of the satellite on top of it. But otherwise, these satellites are identical, built by Boeing, and have identical missions. One of the satellites is heading to an orbital position in geosynchronous orbit at 103 degrees west longitude. The other is heading to 131 degrees west longitude, and this will enable coverage across the entire continental United States, Hawaii, Alaska, and neighboring parts of North America, providing television programming and radio broadcast services, again, across North America in the C-band frequencies. These 2 satellites are heading to orbit to replace some aging SES C-band satellites that are no longer in service, that are now obsolete because the Federal Communications Commission has repurposed some of the C-band spectrum for use in terrestrial 5G service from satellite service to terrestrial service. And companies like SES are having to launch new satellites tuned to a different part of the C-band spectrum to continue providing television broadcast services from space. These companies like SES and Intelsat are actually being reimbursed for these new satellites and their launches by the 5G companies who have bid to take some of that C-band spectrum once used for satellite services. So that's the mission profile for tonight. From liftoff until the final payload separation is 6 hours and 18 minutes. We won't be live throughout that entire flight. We'll have updates after the completion of the second burn and the coast phase and payload separation on our homepage on spaceflightnow.com and on social media. The Centaur upper stage on tonight's mission is actually outfitted with a mission extension kit. It has additional helium pressurant, has some radiation shielding, and has additional battery capacity to enable it to survive for more than 6 hours from launch until payload deployment. Here's some additional views of these two satellites heading to orbit tonight, SES-20 and SES-21. On the left is an image from the payload processing facility near Cape Canaveral, where these two satellites were connected together and then mounted on the launch vehicle adapter before encapsulation inside the Atlas V's payload fairing. You can see these satellites together stand several stories tall and actually weigh about 3.3 metric tons combined. On the upper right is a view of these two satellites separately before they were stacked together. After shipment from Boeing's satellite factory out in Southern California, these two satellites rode to Florida by truck, where they were delivered in August for final launch processing. And on the bottom right is an artist concept from Boeing of what these satellites will look like in orbit. You can see each of them has a single C-band deployable reflector antenna, and they will also be extending two solar array wings to generate electricity after they separate from the Centaur upper stage of the Atlas V rocket. The Atlas V, after liftoff tonight, will be heading due east. Again, it's targeting an equatorial geosynchronous orbit, and that requires a launch due east from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. We've labeled Space Launch Complex 41 here on this map. The red line shows the approximate ground track out over the Atlantic Ocean. It'll be heading east, and it will cross the equator over the central Atlantic Ocean, and then head out over Africa. And then it'll begin climbing up to geosynchronous altitude after that second burn of the Centaur upper stage, as we described in that mission profile video from ULA a few minutes ago. Here's an overview of the Atlas V rocket in this configuration. It's called the 531. The 5 denotes that the rocket is flying with a 5.4 meter diameter payload fairing produced by a company called Beyond Gravity. If you're familiar with the space industry, you may know them better as Ruag Space. It's a Swiss company, but they have a facility in the U.S. where they build these payload fairings for United Launch Alliance. The 3 in 531 signifies that there are 3 strap-on solid-fueled rocket motors clustered around the first stage of the Atlas V. These motors are produced by Northrop Grumman. They're called GEM 63s. Here, the GEM 63s are known as graphite epoxy motors, and the 63 is the diameter, 63 inches in diameter for each of these motors. The 1 means there is a single RL-10 engine on the Centaur upper stage. That RL-10 C11 engine comes from Aerojet Rocketdyne, and it's part of the RL-10 engine family that's also used on the Delta IV rocket. It's also going to be used on ULA's next generation Vulcan Centaur rocket, which is replacing the Atlas and Delta rocket families. And of course, a variant of the RL-10 engine, if you're familiar with NASA's Artemis moon program, is the upper stage engine on the Space Launch System moon rocket. At the bottom of the rocket, at the bottom of the Atlas V, is the Russian-made RD-180 engine. It's produced by a company called MPO Energomash, located near Moscow. And this engine burns kerosene and liquid oxygen. It'll burn for about 4 minutes to get the rocket out of the atmosphere and begin tonight's marathon 6-hour mission. The rest of the flight after the first stage boost is completed will be performed by the Centaur upper stage. Now 10.5 minutes remaining until the opening of tonight's launch window. If you're just joining us, thanks for doing so. You're looking at a live view of Space Launch Complex 41 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida, where United Launch Alliance has an Atlas V rocket fully loaded, fully fueled for launch at 5:36 p.m. Eastern Time, 21:36 UTC. If you haven't had a chance to do so, please hit the like button on our YouTube stream. This helps us ensure we're bringing this live launch coverage to as many people as possible. You can also please support our coverage. Please consider supporting our coverage by becoming a member of our YouTube channel. We have different membership tiers available for you to choose from, and depending on which level you select, you can gain access to bonus video features for members only. Now less than 10 minutes remaining until the opening of the launch window. We're standing by from the pre-launch readiness poll from launch conductor Ron McKee at the Atlas Space Flight Operations Center. We're going to play the audio now from launch conductor Ron McKee in the next few minutes to talk about, well, he'll be doing his final pre-launch readiness poll of different elements, different consoles of the launch control team at the Atlas Space Flight Operations Center. We expect that poll momentarily.
Engineers and managers.
L minus 7 minutes.
Status check to proceed with terminal count. Atlas systems, propulsion.
Go.
Hydraulics.
Go.
Pneumatics.
Go.
LO2.
Go.
Water.
Go.
Centaur systems, propulsion.
Go.
Pneumatics.
Go.
LO2.
Go.
LH2.
Go.
Has gas.
Go.
Electrical systems, airborne.
Go.
Ground.
Go.
Facility.
Go.
RFFTS.
Go.
Flight control.
Go.
GCQ.
Go.
Operation support.
Go.
COM. Umbilicals.
Go.
ECS.
Go.
Red light monitor.
Go.
Quality.
Go.
Op safety manager.
Go.
Fuel safety officer.
Go.
Vehicle system engineer.
Go.
Anomaly chief.
Go.
Range coordinator.
Clear to proceed.
Launch director.
You have permission to launch.
Proceeding with the count. ALC verified T0 set for 21:360.
Verified.
That was the voice of launch conductor Ron McKee polling his Atlas V launch team at the Atlas Space Flight Operations Center here at Cape Canaveral. And as you heard, all stations reported go for launch at 5:36 p.m. Eastern Time, 21:36 UTC. That countdown clock is expected to resume at T-minus 4 minutes in about a minute and a half. "40 seconds remaining until the built-in hold comes to an end and the countdown clock resumes. The countdown has resumed at T-minus 4 minutes. No more holds are planned in the remainder of the countdown, as the Atlas V is configured for launch at 5:36 p.m. Eastern Time. This will be the 96th flight of an Atlas V, the 6th Atlas V launch of the year. Everything looking good for liftoff, 3 minutes, 34 seconds. Ground pyrotechnics have been enabled as planned, T-minus 3 minutes, 20 seconds. In the next few minutes, the replenishment of the Atlas V's cryogenic propellant tanks will end to allow those tanks to be pressurized for flight. And the first and second stage of the Atlas V will be transitioned from ground power to onboard internal battery power. Coming up on T-minus 3 minutes. Replenishment of liquid oxygen into the Atlas first stage is now being secured. The Atlas tanks are being brought to flight pressure at this time. The flight termination system on the Atlas V rocket is now on internal power. T-minus 2 minutes, 33 seconds and counting. T-minus 2 minutes and 16 seconds. Everything looking good for launch this evening from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida. Both the Atlas V's first stage tanks are reported at flight pressure. At T-minus 2 minutes, the Atlas first stage and Centaur upper stage will be switched to internal power. T-minus 90 seconds. The flight termination system is now armed. T-minus 1 minute, 20 seconds.
120. OTU's armed.
T-minus 60 seconds. The Range Operations Center reports the eastern range is green. Everything looking good for liftoff. Topping of all of the cryogenic tanks on the Atlas V is now complete. Those tanks are at flight pressure. T-minus 40. T-minus 30 seconds.
28.
Verify ECS reduced for launch.
Verify.
Status check. Go Atlas.
T-minus 20. Final status check. Go Atlas, go Centaur, go SES reported from the Launch Control Center. T-minus 10 seconds. We'll stand by for RD-180 ignition at T-minus 2.7 seconds. There's engine start and liftoff. Liftoff of ULA's Atlas V rocket heading to orbit with 2 commercial communications satellites. Atlas V has cleared the Lightning Towers out at Pad 41, heading east from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. T-plus 20 seconds. Atlas V now passing into some cloud cover here. We're going to switch to ULA's stream, showing a better view of the Atlas V rocket heading downrange, also showing some onboard camera views. Beautiful shot from an onboard camera on the Atlas V, looking down at one of the 3 strap-on solid rocket boosters, passing 90 seconds into the flight now. No problems reported so far. We're now approaching burnout of that solid rocket booster. All 3 SRBs have burned out, according to ULA. Should see jettison of that those 3 solid rocket boosters in just a few moments. And there is jettison of the solid rocket boosters. See that booster in the field of view there, falling away from the Atlas V. This tracking camera showing the boosters falling away. They'll fall into the Atlantic Ocean and be expended. The RD-180 engine continues firing on the Atlas first stage. This engine produces more than 800,000 pounds of thrust at full power. The next major milestone is coming up in about 50 seconds. Is going to be the jettison of the payload fairing on top of the Atlas V to reveal the 2 SCS commercial communications satellites once the rocket climbs above the thick lower layers of the atmosphere. Altitude now is about 50 miles above Earth. Great view looking back toward the launch site from this rear-facing camera on the Atlas V, T plus 3 minutes. Coming up on payload fairing jettison in just about 5 seconds. We hope to see that in this view. And there is payload fairing jettison, visual confirmation, one of the halves of the payload fairing there. That was followed by jettison of what's known as the Centaur forward load reactor, just below the payload fairing to reveal the Centaur upper stage, which is also encapsulated during the launch by the fairing. About 30 seconds remaining now in the boost phase of the mission. The RD-180 engine will throttle down. This throttle down is maintaining a constant 4G acceleration limit on the Atlas V. About 12 seconds remaining before booster engine cutoff. Here's a view of the RL-10 engine on the upper stage. We've heard confirmation of booster engine cutoff, and there's stage separation. The spent Atlas first stage now jettisoning. It will fall down into the Atlantic Ocean. It will not be recovered. And there is ignition of the RL-10 engine. The Centaur upper stage is now firing to continue the climb into orbit with the SES-20 and SES-21 satellites. Now approaching T plus 5 minutes. No issues reported so far in the early portions of today's launch. This is the first of 3 RL-10 engine burns on tonight's mission. This burn is intended to place the rocket and the 2 payloads into a preliminary low-altitude parking orbit just a few hundred miles above the Earth. The 2 subsequent burns later tonight will raise the orbit, culminating in deployment of the 2 SES commercial TV broadcasting satellites very late tonight, about 6 hours after liftoff. T plus 6 minutes, no issues reported so far in the flight of the Atlas V rocket. ULA's telemetry commentator reports that the first stage had nominal performance, good performance from the first stage booster, putting the Centaur upper stage right where it needed to be to begin its phase of the flight. Again, 3 Centaur burns are required for this mission tonight to deploy these 2 commercial communications satellites. T plus 7 minutes, 15 seconds. We're now streaming a view of the empty launch pad here at Cape Canaveral, where the Atlas V took off more than 7 minutes ago to begin tonight's mission. Everything going well so far in the flight. T plus 7 minutes, 30 seconds. We're now back to animation provided by ULA. This showing the Centaur upper stage firing its RL-10 engine, the 2 SES communication satellites stacked one on top of the other. On the right side in this frame of view, the rocket is passing over the Bahamas, actually just off the coast of the Bahamas, heading east from Cape Canaveral over the Atlantic Ocean. About 4 minutes remaining in this particular burn of the RL-10 engine. Again, this Centaur RL-10 burn is intended to place the rocket into a preliminary parking orbit. Altitude is currently 150 miles. Downrange distance is about 1,200 miles. In the ULA animation, you can see some of the flight data being displayed, showing the orbital parameters. It'll be interesting to note if you're into orbital dynamics, the figures change over the course of the next couple of minutes. So the perigee altitude, that's the low point of the orbit that the rocket is currently in, is currently negative because the orbit would actually intersect the surface of the Earth at the current velocity. That number is increasing. It'll pass 0, and that perigee altitude should end up more than a couple hundred kilometers above the Earth. We'll see what the final figure is for the parking orbit, but it should be above 0 when that engine cuts off to ensure that the Centaur upper stage and the 2 satellites are safely in a parking orbit to begin tonight's mission. Now 9 minutes into the flight. About 3 minutes, a little less than 3 minutes remaining until engine cutoff. T plus 10 minutes, 40 seconds. We should see engine cutoff on the Centaur upper stage at T plus 11 minutes, 52 seconds. So a little more than a minute remaining in this burn. You can see the perigee altitude is just passing minus 650 kilometers, heading towards 0. And that should become a positive figure when the engine shuts down. T plus 11 minutes. .30 seconds remaining in this burn. And we've confirmed main engine cutoff. That's the report from United Launch Alliance, and you can see the orbit numbers there, 163 by 611 kilometers. This is very close to the pre-flight prediction. Now passing 12 minutes into the flight. This coast phase now between engine cutoff and the restart of the Centaur upper stage should last about 12 minutes or so. The restart of the Centaur upper stage is set for about T plus 23 minutes and 51 seconds. We expect ULA's live broadcast may end before that burn. If they do, we will not be able to continue to bring you this live animation, which is helpful for our coverage. So we hope they'll stay up for this second burn. Everything looking good on the Centaur upper stage during this coast phase, which is scheduled to last about 10 more minutes before another critical burn by the RL-10 engine to begin reshaping its orbit, heading toward a more elliptical or oval-shaped orbit, and it'll stretch the apogee or high point of its orbit up to near 22,000 miles or near 35,000 kilometers. This is the current configuration of the Atlas V rocket in its parking orbit, with the Centaur upper stage on the left. On the far left is the RL-10 engine from Aerojet Rocketdyne. And then there are the two SES communication satellites stacked one on top of the other. About 9 minutes left in this coast period before the restart of the RL-10 engine. Unfortunately, ULA's live broadcast has ended, so we won't be able to bring you the continued live streaming animation of the Atlas V for the remainder of tonight's mission. We wish we could. Now T plus 15 minutes into the flight. On the right of your screen is a view of the empty launch pad at Space Launch Complex 41, where the Atlas V took off 15 minutes ago to begin tonight's mission. Again, this is a very long 6+ hour mission from liftoff until the time of the final payload deployment for SES. Now about 5 minutes remaining until the restart of the Atlas V's upper stage engine. This burn coming up is set to begin about T plus 24 minutes, will last a few minutes to place the Centaur upper stage into a more elliptical or egg-shaped type orbit. It'll raise the apogee or high point of the orbit from 611 kilometers to near 35,000 kilometers. So the Centaur upper stage will do a lot of lifting during this upcoming burn. The Centaur RL-10 engine is produced by Aerojet Rocketdyne. It produces about 24,000 pounds of thrust. And this upcoming burn is set to last about 5 minutes. Now a minute remaining until the expected restart of the Centaur upper stage RL-10 engine. Again, ULA's live broadcast has ended, so we're not getting any live animation for this upcoming critical burn that we can bring to you, unfortunately. And ULA has also cut the countdown audio feed they provide to the news media at T plus 20 minutes. This was as expected. It's not an indication of any problem with the flight. But unfortunately, some of our updates that we relay to you during this upcoming burn may be a bit delayed due to the lack of information or timely information from ULA. ULA has confirmed on their website that the main engine start number 2 has occurred, so the Centaur upper stage has ignited its RL-10 engine. This burn is expected to last about 5 minutes to propel the SES-20 and 21 satellites into the proper elliptical geostationary transfer orbit. And this will be followed by a third burn more than 5 hours from now to do the final maneuver to place the 2 payloads into the targeted circular geosynchronous orbit for spacecraft separation. Here's a frame from ULA's mission profile video showing what the current configuration of the Atlas V is. We saw the 3 solid rocket boosters separate and jettison and fall into the Atlantic Ocean, as well as the payload fairing. And then the first stage booster also fell into the Atlantic Ocean after its job was complete. And that leaves the Centaur upper stage with its RL-10 engine and the 2 SES communications satellite payloads still together during this next phase of the flight. Again, 3 burns of the RL-10 engine on the Centaur upper stage are planned this evening. 1 already complete, the second one now underway. And just to recap, ULA has ended their live broadcast and ended their live audio stream from the Launch Control Center that they provide to news media. So unfortunately, any updates we're relaying to you may come with a bit of a delay as we try to confirm these critical flight events. Should be about 30 seconds remaining in this second firing by the Centaur upper stage RL-10 engine. We'll stand by for confirmation of engine cutoff when we get it. We'll pass that along when we get it. This burn again is intended to propel these 2 satellites into a higher, more elliptical geostationary transfer orbit. ULA has now confirmed main engine cutoff number 2. This completes the second burn on tonight's mission. This was a planned 5-minute engine firing by the RL-10 on the Centaur upper stage. And with this burn complete, it's now more than 5 hours until the next major event in tonight's launch sequence, which is the third Centaur engine burn, which is set to occur about 5.5 hours after liftoff. We expect that that third burn by the Centaur upper stage to occur around 11:10 p.m. Eastern Time. That's about 3:10 a.m. UTC. So as you can see, it's about a 5-hour wait until the next major event on tonight's launch. And that third burn is intended to circularize the now elliptical orbit into a more circular path around Earth. And it also takes out a lot of inclination in the orbit and maneuvers the rocket and the 2 satellites onto an orbit very close to the equator. And in this orbit, about 22,000 miles above Earth, the satellites will orbit at roughly the same rate as the planet rotates. So this gives the satellites a fixed geographic coverage zone for their communications instruments. And then we'll see SES-20 separate at T plus 5 hours 38 minutes, and that'll be followed by deployment of the SES-21 communications satellite at 6 hours and 18 minutes. Again, tonight's mission is fairly lengthy as far as a typical launch sequence. It takes about 6 hours to inject these 2 satellites into their targeted geosynchronous orbit, actually just short of geosynchronous orbit. This is the altitude that the mission is targeting. The Centaur's guidance computer will aim to release SES-20, one of the 2 TV broadcasting satellites, into a near circular orbit about 21,745 miles above the Earth at an inclination of 1.9 degrees. And then about 40 minutes later, the second of the 2 nearly identical satellites, named SES-21, will deploy from the Centaur upper stage into a very similar orbit, again nearly 22,000 miles or about 35,000 kilometers above the Earth. And the Centaur upper stage on this mission is carrying what's called a mission extension kit. It has additional helium pressurant, additional battery capacity to enable it to perform these long-duration missions instead of a typical upper stage mission that may last an hour or 2, sometimes as few as 10 minutes. This upper stage will go for more than 6 hours from the time of liftoff until its job is complete, with deployment of its 2 payloads. So right now the rocket is coasting from its current altitude of less than 1,000 miles up to nearly 22,000 miles above the Earth, and this enables these 2 satellites to be released very close to their operational orbit. And instead of requiring these satellites to use their own propulsion to reach their operational positions, which can take months, the satellites will have to use less propellant and can reach their operational positions within weeks of launch, enabling them to enter commercial service faster and to start that revenue stream for SES much more rapidly than they would if they had launched into a more traditional lower transfer orbit, as most other rockets would do. With another launch now complete, at least from the range perspective here at Cape Canaveral, there have now been 42 orbital launch attempts, space launch attempts from the eastern range here at Cape Canaveral, Florida, either from pads at the Space Force Station or at Kennedy Space Center so far this year. And this extends the record, which was previously 32 space launch attempts in a single calendar year. We're now at 42 here on Florida Space Coast. And the lion's share of these missions, you can see here in blue, we've labeled the SpaceX missions in blue here. Most of these launches this year have been SpaceX flights. So there have been 42 space launch attempts so far this year in total here at the Cape. 2 by Astra, the small satellite launch company. Both of those actually failed to reach orbit, but they're counted in the tally of space launch attempts. This was the 6th ULA launch from here in Florida this year. And then the remaining 34 launches this year have been by SpaceX Falcon 9 rockets. Most of those have been Starlink missions to deploy satellites for SpaceX's commercial internet network. And looking back at the previous years, we're now at 42 launches. We've quadrupled, more or less, some of the launch rates we saw a decade ago. And still more than 2 months remaining in the calendar year. And we expect to see at least 10 to 12 more launches here at Cape Canaveral or Kennedy Space Center before the end of the year. Most of those will be SpaceX missions, and there may be one launch attempt by Relativity Space before the end of the year, and we're anticipating seeing the launch of NASA's Artemis 1 moon rocket before the end of the year as well. So, good chance that the Cape sees more than 50 launch attempts this year, which would extend the record from 32, which was the most the spaceport had experienced in a single calendar year until 2022. The next launch from Florida Space Coast is scheduled for tomorrow, just about 16 hours away, 18 hours away rather, if I get my math right, at noon Eastern Time tomorrow, or 1600 UTC, and that'll be the launch of a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket from Launch Complex 39A. Here's a live shot of the Falcon 9 and SpaceX's Dragon Endurance spacecraft on top. This mission will carry a team of 4 to the space station, 2 NASA astronauts, 1 Japanese astronaut, and 1 Russian cosmonaut to begin a planned expedition lasting about 5 months to perform science experiments and maintenance at the International Space Station. These astronauts and cosmonaut will replace the outgoing Crew 4 mission, which has been on the space station since April, and that team of 4 astronauts is scheduled to return to Earth with a splashdown in mid-October off the coast of Florida. We'll have live coverage tomorrow beginning around 8 a.m. Eastern Time, or about 1200 UTC, from Kennedy Space Center, and we'll carry you throughout the entire countdown. We'll watch the astronauts as they board the Crew Dragon spacecraft, getting ready for launch at noon Eastern Time, 1600 UTC. This will be the 8th crew flight on SpaceX's Dragon spacecraft overall, and the 5th operational crew rotation flight under contract to NASA. So we're looking forward to covering that launch from here at Kennedy Space Center tomorrow, just about 17 hours and 42 minutes from now. Looking ahead beyond Crew 5, SpaceX is planning to launch a Falcon 9 rocket from Vandenberg Space Force Base tomorrow evening as well, with a batch of 52 Starlink Internet satellites. That scheduled launch from Vandenberg Space Force Base is predicated on the launch of the Crew 5 mission. So the launch from Vandenberg will only go forward tomorrow if the Crew 5 mission gets off the ground at noon tomorrow from here in Florida. And that's because NASA requires a couple of days of data review between a previous Falcon 9 launch before they give the green light for a crew launch on the Falcon 9. So that Falcon 9 launch will have to occur after the Crew 5 mission in order to avoid that data review requirement from NASA. NASA, of course, reviews data from all Falcon 9 missions. They want to make sure everything performed as expected and there weren't any hidden issues in any of these launches leading up to a crew launch. So tomorrow, as currently laid out, we have 2 Falcon 9 launches, 1 from Florida, 1 from California. And then on Thursday, 2 more launches by U.S. rocket companies on tap. One is a Rocket Lab Electron Launch vehicle, which is set to launch from the company's private spaceport in New Zealand, carrying a satellite named Gazelle for the company General Atomics. And this satellite actually has a data relay payload called Argos 4, which will relay search and rescue information and transmissions, as well as weather satellite or weather buoy data from remote locations to scientists and search and rescue type forces. This is a small satellite. A microsatellite weighs a couple hundred pounds. This launch is set to go from New Zealand by the company Rocket Lab. And then later on Thursday evening here at Cape Canaveral, Florida, we'll be back for coverage of another Falcon 9 launch by SpaceX, carrying 2 satellites for Intelsat. These satellites are named Galaxy 33 and Galaxy 34, and these are commercial C-band TV broadcasting satellites, very similar in mission to the 2 SES ComSats we saw launched on the Atlas V this evening. These satellites are for Intelsat, a competitor to SES in the commercial telecommunications, satellite communications market. And those are set to fly from Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station on a SpaceX Falcon 9 Thursday evening, right around sunset. That could be a very spectacular launch if you're in the area around the Space Coast. Be sure to look up around 7 p.m. Eastern Time Thursday night. Before we sign off for the evening, we want to thank all of our Spaceflight Now members for joining us for our coverage and helping us support our ability to bring you this live streaming video and commentary from Kennedy Space Center for all of these launches, including tonight's Atlas V mission. If you want to contribute and help us support our coverage, you can become a Spaceflight Now member on our YouTube channel. You can join. We have different membership tiers available for you to choose from, and depending on which level you select, you can gain access to bonus video features we have there for members only, and you'll be supporting our coverage and helping us continue to bring you events like this one. You can also support our coverage through the Super Chat function on YouTube, and we have our Spaceflight Now store at shop.spaceflightnow.com, where we have a number of items there for sale, including the Crew 5 mission patch. This is the mission patch for the Crew Dragon flight to the space station. We're hoping to see launch tomorrow at noon Eastern Time. Here's a live shot of the Falcon 9 and Crew Dragon spacecraft out on Launch Complex 39A. A little less than 18 hours until the expected launch time there. So you can go to shop.spaceflightnow.com to buy the Crew 5 mission patch and other items. And this also helps support our coverage of the space industry and the space program. We'll leave you with one last look of empty Launch Complex 41 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, where the Atlas V launched nearly 50 minutes ago now with the SES-20 and SES-21 communications satellites. Those satellites are now on their way toward geosynchronous orbit. We'll be updating our website at spaceflightnow.com and on social media later tonight when we confirm the successful separation of these 2 satellites from the Atlas V Centaur upper stage. So until tomorrow, with our Crew 5 launch coverage in the morning, I'm Stephen Clark from Kennedy Space Center, reporting live for spaceflightnow.com. We'll see you next time.